Good afternoon. You are listening to Smooth Operator. I'm your host, Bennett Bedoukian, subbing in for Matthew Poppleton. With me in the studio today, we have Sue Chan, who is here to talk about Pollinator Day in Peterborough County. And hi.
Hi.
So tell me a bit about yourself. You were just saying that you are teaching a course at Trent and obviously have some familiarity with pollinators. So let's just tell people about yourself before we talk about the day.
Okay, so I started off my interest with bees as a beekeeper, a honey beekeeper, and I still am a honey beekeeper, but that's where I began at McGill in their agriculture program, learning about honeybees. And then I went on to do my master's degree, and I wanted to study honeybees, but instead I ended up studying a native bee. Because the prof that I was taken on with, he directed me towards a native bee study. So that's where I got introduced to the world of bees other than honeybees. And so I finished my graduate studies there and then have just had an ongoing interest in native bees. So in the past about 4 years, I've been involved in creating a native pollinators program at Farms at Work, which is a local not-for-profit based here in Peterborough.
So I got about a few questions out of that answer. But first one is you were mentioning honeybees versus native bees, and I didn't realize that honeybees were not native.
No, they're kind of, I describe them as domesticated insects in the same way that a cow is a domesticated animal. So they were brought with colonists to provide honey and beeswax to the first settlers. And so they were probably, they may have been brought to the United States and then brought north. That's probably the most likely scenario, although I don't really know that for sure. But they don't belong here. They're European.
They're European?
Yeah.
And do native bees here produce honey?
No, they don't. So we do have some native bees that produce honey. Those are the bumblebees. But the honey that they produce is very small amounts, just for their daily use. And you wouldn't want to have to be the one who was going in to harvest it.
Okay. It'd be a little painful?
It would be a little painful, and you'd get about a tablespoon for your efforts.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you just said. So, so when you're harvesting honey from bees like this, you can only really get it from honeybees.
Right. Yeah. So if you want honeybees are the thing.
Yeah.
If you want beeswax, honeybees are the thing.
Great.
If you want pollination, on the other hand.
Yes, and that's what we're here to talk about.
That's right.
Yeah. So Pollinator Day, that's happening at the Douro Community Center.
Yep. On Saturday, November 1st from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's a full-day event. There's a hot lunch served, and there'll be a number of topics covered. So I'll be covering, first of all, introducing folk to native pollinators, what they are, what they look like, interesting things about them, lots of great photographs, lots of great stories. And then I'll go on to talking about sort of the challenges that are facing native bees. These are the same challenges that are facing honeybees, but my context is native bees. And then we'll go on and talk about how we can conserve native bees. What are the actions we can take to provide habitat to prevent death?
Fair enough, yeah. So native bees, so bee species are different than wasps or yellow jackets and whatever.
Yeah, that's a question that everybody asks me, and people love to think of wasps as the bad guys and bees as the good guys. It's not like that, folks.
But wasps are not pollinators in the same way?
Well, they are not equipped to move pollen in the same way because they're not hairy. They're kind of shiny, and that's because they're not really pollen eaters. So they don't have a need to be hairy. They are actually predators. They eat other insects. So, they're not the bad guys. They are actually really important in pest control.
So for me, I never knew that bees eat pollen.
Oh, yes.
So they're eating the pollen, and then what is the honey then used for?
Okay, so that's a great question, too. I just never even imagined that. Anyway, so pollen is the protein source. So it's like your meat. So in the case of wasps, they get their protein from other insects. In the case of bees, they get their protein from pollen. And then nectar is their energy source. And so all bees use both of them. Most bees use both of them. And a lot of the bees are actually not consuming very much of the pollen that they collect. They're actually feeding it to their offspring.
And then honey is a byproduct of this process, or?
No, honey is a byproduct of nectar production, of
Okay.
nectar consumption. So what honeybees do is they take the nectar, they amass it, they actually change it chemically inside of themselves, and then they remove the water, and that's what honey is.
And then once it's honey, it's not of use to the honeybee anymore.
Oh yeah, it is.
Oh, really?
yeah, that's
Also
what they
didn't know
eat.
that. Oh, they eat that?
Yeah, they
Oh.
produce honey so that
Yeah.
they can survive the winter. And
Okay.
other bees don't survive the winter as adults, so they don't need to eat anything. They're actually sort of in a hibernative state as a pupa. They survive the winter as pupa. So there aren't any adults going through the winter, whereas in honeybees there are adults going through the winter. That's the only group of bees in Ontario that go through the winter as adults.
And so native bees go through as a pupa, you're
That's
saying?
right. Yep.
And would that be the same for wasps and those things?
Wasps, yes. And now bumblebees are a little bit different. So bumblebees, only the queen survives as an adult, and she goes through the winter as an adult. But all the other bees die.
And she will go into hibernation or something?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so she's not eating anything over the winter. She's in a hibernative state, and she comes out the next year and starts a new colony.
Neat.
Yeah, it is kind of cool.
Yeah, totally.
I'm obviously
Yeah.
thinking it's cool. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yes, this is something you're very interested in. So there are other pollinators other than bees, though.
Yes. So flies. There are a lot of flies that visit flowers for the nectar.
We're talking like house flies or something.
Yeah. Well, there are many kinds of
Yes,
flies.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so not necessarily house flies. There are flower flies. And these flies visit flowers, and they are a little bit hairy. They get pollen on themselves, and they can transfer it. They're especially important in flowers like in the carrot family. So Queen
Like,
Anne's lace,
yeah,
carrot,
yarrow, that kind of
parsley. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah, flowers that have a flat surface.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so you have flies, butterflies.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
butterflies can be important in transfer of pollen too because they have their bodies are
Yeah.
hairy. Okay,
Yeah.
so they can transfer pollen. But I would say that these are not the most important pollinators. The most important pollinators are the most numerous, the most varied are the bees.
Neat.
Yeah.
And, roughly how many species of native bees are we talking about
We
here?
have about 400 in Ontario.
400
Yeah.
species.
Yep.
Wow. And is it easy to tell the difference between them, or do they all look
No,
relative?
it's very difficult to identify a bee to species or even to genus.
Really?
So what we try to do is give people idea of common ones and then tell them what family that is in. So that's the approach that I would take. And I don't think there's really, unless you want to be a taxonomist, there's no really any need for the common person to identify the species at this point anyway.
And the problems, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the problems that are affecting bees right now.
Yeah, so I would characterize the problems sort of in three areas, but two of them are the most important. One of them is a general loss of habitat.
The loss of habitat.
So what that means is a loss of place to live and a loss of something to eat. Okay, so if you look out across the agricultural landscape, for example, what you see is a lot of monocultures. And those monocultures may provide some food for bees, but the period of time in which they provide it is very narrow, right? It's only when the crop is in bloom. So corn actually provides pollen to bees. It provides no nectar, but that pollen is only available when the corn is in tassel.
Which
Okay.
is very brief.
Yes.
Like a
And
week or
the same
two.
thing with canola. Canola is a great nectar and pollen source, but it's only in bloom for a narrow period of time, and then after that, there's nothing to eat. And if you think about a bee, so bees fly, honeybees about 3 kilometers, bumblebees about 1 kilometer, and native bees, some of them are 100 meters. That's all they can fly.
100 meters.
Yeah, from their nest to their food source. So you can see how their world would be very interrupted by a 100-acre field of monoculture.
Is their ability to fly that distance, is that physiological, or is it just
It's related to their size.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an energy thing. You know,
Yeah.
they can only store so much energy. So that's their world. So one of the nice things about native bees is that their world could actually be a backyard. So there's lots of opportunity in urban settings to create a safe habitat for native bees.
is what are the things that, whether you have a backyard or you have, an acre or you live in the country, like what are things that people can do either to promote habitat or nesting sites or things?
Well, the first thing I ask people to do is think about plantings, making plantings. And if you've got an urban setting, you want to incorporate the plantings into your landscaping of your yard. I would suggest using native plants and then looking. Farms at Work has lists of native plants that are good for pollinators, but there are lots of other lists too. We're not the only people who have lists. So look up lists and then start planting those. Another thing I would say is you need to be very careful to avoid nursery plants from the big box stores because they're often treated with neonicotinoids, which I'll talk about in a minute, which are toxic to bees. So it's a very strange situation where you're buying things for bees and they're actually toxic.
Huh.
Yeah, so that's one thing you can do. And then the other thing, so you can do that at any scale. At a farm scale, it's a little bit more complex, and I'll talk about that a little bit on Saturday, on November 1st. And then the other thing you need to do is create nesting habitat. So they're sort of basically two places that bees nest. They nest in stems above ground, hollow stems.
And stems like a grass stem?
Yeah, a grass stem, pithy stems. Phragmites, that's a great... Phragmites is that tall grass that's invasive or on the side of the road. You see it all over the place. Yeah.
Invasive but great for native pollinators.
Well, yeah. Well, I think its invasiveness is worse than, it outweighs its... But what I'm saying is that kind of a hollow stem, daylilies have a hollow stem like that. What else has a hollow stem? I'm having a brain freeze here. Sumac. So sumac doesn't have a hollow stem. It has a pithy stem, but that pith dies back. So in old branches of sumac, bees can nest there. So that's one place, above ground in pithy stems. I have a front door where there are holes where the screws are supposed to go to hold the door to the house, and bees have nested in those holes. So they'll nest in any cavity like that, as long as it's the right size.
But we're talking about small nest sizes.
Yes, we're talking about small. So 3/8 of an inch.
Okay.
Is the diameter. We're talking small. So think about, bamboo is those small bamboo reeds. That would be, I prefer something that grows here.
Like
but you
a
could use
horsetail or whatever?
Yeah. Well, a horsetail, no. A horsetail's not hollow.
Oh, it's not?
No.
Okay.
No. It's got too many, it's hollow for a very short distance, and then it's got a node, and that node isn't hollow, so that won't work. But anyway, I'll be showing you some examples. There will be actually building a Phragmites stem nest on Pollinator Day. The other group of bees are those that live in the ground. And so for those bees, you can't make nests for them, but what you can do is provide bare ground. So leave part of your garden without a lot of mulch on the top. So that's important.
Are they looking for any kind of soil in particular?
They're not wanting waterlogged soils, of course.
Sandy soil or
Well,
something?
some bees prefer sandy soil. Some bees want something a little more substance, like a loam. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of the bees really want to work with clay soils because they're quite difficult to work with. So, any of the soils around here I think are quite suitable. You'll have different bees choosing different places. They like a southern exposure. They like short grass. So in a lawn, you'll often find bees nesting in a lawn that's mowed, not a tall grass situation.
That's the only reason I've got so far to mow my lawn.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now you can't escape it. You got to mow your lawn, Bennett.
But then all my flowers die. Is the thing. I've got great flowers each, couple weeks, another one, and that's why I don't mow them.
Yeah, so that's really an important point. The important point there is that you want a situation where you've got many different kinds of flowers blooming over the whole season, because that provides a buffet over the whole season. Some bees are around from April till October. Other bees are around for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month. And so during the time that they're around, they need something to eat.
And that is what I have seen at my dad's place. There's some ground nesting bees.
Yes.
And I was sure they were not like the ground hornets because they didn't look like it, but I was concerned. I'm allergic to hornets and wasps.
Okay.
But they never stung me. But they're only there for about 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And they live short grass, bare soil.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So they're over at Camp Kawartha's Environment Center, on the path going behind their place, there are ground nesting bees that nest in that pathway, so you can go over in the summertime and see them.
And that will look like lots of little holes.
Yep. They're bigger than, so ants make nests in the ground, and they have tiny little holes. But these are, if you think about a pencil, about the size of a pencil, that's the size. Yeah, or a straw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just going back to what you were saying about nesting in hollow-stemmed plants.
Yeah.
So how big is a colony at that point?
They don't live in colonies at all. They're individual nesters. So every female makes her own nest, and she may make her nest close to other females or not, depending on the species. So if I got a bundle of reeds and I put them all together, then each reed would be one nest. So you consider the bundle sort of like a condominium or an apartment building, and they wouldn't all get filled up necessarily.
And then the male bees don't live with the females?
No, they don't. So their job really is to mate the females, and so they'll tend to be in places where the females eat.
Okay.
Yeah, so they tend to be on flowers. That's where they tend to mate. That's not always so. Sometimes they'll mate around the nest. It depends on the species.
Neat. And then, so sudden hive collapse is not really the thing for these species?
No, colony collapse disorder is something related to honeybees, but it's related to the other problem that we have, which is not loss of habitat, but introduction of a type of insecticide called neonicotinoids. And it's a mouthful. I counted the syllables. I think it's 6 syllables. That's why it's so hard to say. These are systemic insecticides that are used on all crops in Ontario. And so there's a lot of research now coming to the forefront demonstrating how these neonicotinoids are interrupting life cycle, interrupting foraging ability, interrupting reproductive efficiency in all bees, not just honeybees. So colony collapse disorder is attributed in a lot of the literature to neonicotinoid exposure, which makes queens not able to reproduce, foragers not able to forage. It basically eliminates the ability of a hive to survive over time.
So my understanding of wasps, you get those things from the hardware store. They look like fake wasp nests, right?
Yeah.
Will that affect your bee populations?
No, it's got nothing to do with bee
So they're not concerned about, a hive close to their hive type thing?
Well, obviously, if there are too many bees or too many creatures eating the same food source, then there's competition. So if you've got too many, let's say you've got, 10 hives of bees, then that's going to affect, for example, a property. That's going to affect whether there's enough nectar for native bees. But often what happens is that native bees are actually better at foraging on native plants than honeybees are because they've evolved
with those plants.
Yeah. So a great example is squashes and pumpkins. So squashes and pumpkins are not a native plant to Ontario, but they were brought up by the Indigenous people following the Three Sisters cultivation. And so they're actually from Central America. So they're brought up the west coast and then eastward. And then following the cultivation of pumpkins and squash in the Three Sisters were these bees, these squash bees. So they came from the same place. So they just followed along behind.
Is their season the same time as the squash?
Exactly. Yeah, they're adults for exactly the same amount of time that squashes and pumpkin are in flower, and they're active at the same time that squashes and pumpkins bloom during the day. So squashes and pumpkins start blooming at dawn, and they wilt at noon, and the flowers only open for one day. Well, squash bees start foraging at dawn, and they go to sleep at noon.
So if I want to get more squash out of my squash plant, I have to find some squash bees.
Yeah, they've probably already found you. They're very, very common.
Okay.
But I'm very concerned about them because neonicotinoids are used in commercial squash production and pumpkin production. And so that means that these bees, the other thing about these bees is that they only eat pollen from pumpkins and squashes. They don't eat pollen from anything else. And so when they feed their larvae are feeding a diet exclusively of squash or pumpkin pollen. And if that squash or pumpkin pollen is tainted with neonicotinoids, then I am concerned what is happening to the larva.
That's very understandable.
Yeah.
I would be too.
Yes.
I mean,
I hope you are
as you
now.
were explaining it, I was worried.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is the thing about this particular bee, the squash bee, is that it has such strong ties to indigenous culture and history. We need to figure this bee out, and then we need to protect it.
And could you make the argument that that would be helping to protect and enliven indigenous cultures as well?
Absolutely. I mean, this squash bee happens to be that bee that I did my graduate studies on, so I know a lot about it, and I speak about it whenever I speak in public. And I am often approached by Indigenous First Nations people telling me, being so excited because they've seen these bees and they haven't known what they were. And I said, these bees really belong to your culture because you brought them here. They were invasive at some point, many thousands or 1,000 years ago. I'm not sure about when they came, but they are no longer where they're naturalized at this point. Yeah, and they're not like honeybees because honeybees we can't consider them naturalized because they don't survive in Canada without a beekeeper.
It being too cold?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So occasionally you'll have a colony that's able to survive in the wild, but that's very, very. It's very unusual. Mm-hmm. But squash bees survive entirely on their own, so that's why they're naturalized. So I just think there's a great connection, and I'm excited about that connection. Mm-hmm. It has a lot of meaning, other than scientific. Yeah.
So not to diminish that connection. Mm-hmm. At all, but just to be fair, do you have a problem with honeybees? You said you were a beekeeper earlier.
No, absolutely not. Honeybees why? I don't have a problem with cows. I don't have a problem with chickens. I don't have a problem with honeybees. I am a beekeeper. I'm actually a member of the Central Ontario Beekeepers Association, which is the association which represents beekeepers around here. I'm very active in that association, and but I think it's important to understand that honeybees are basically a domesticated. They're a farm animal. Beekeepers are just a certain kind of farmer, and if you want honey, then you better have honeybees because there's no other place to get honey. And honey is a terribly important product. I have a whole lot to say about honey, but not today.
No, we don't really have time for that one. So this time has gone by really quickly, which is great for me. But I'm just gonna clarify double check a couple things. Farms at Work, you can find that where?
You can find us online, so just Google farmsatwork.ca. That's and at the farms at is spelled out. It's not the at sign. Okay, just in case you don't. And then on that at Farms at Work, you'll find we have two mandates. One is to keep farmland active, and the other one is to keep farmland healthy. And so we have all kinds of programming around those two things, and you'll find this. On our homepage, this announcement, and you can actually register for this event at that time when you go on Farms at Work.
And this event is again
on November 1st.
It's November 1st?
Yeah, it's all day from 9 to 4 p.m. And the cost is $30, payable through Eventbrite.
And so we're talking about Pollinator Day?
Yes.
And it is where?
It's at the Douro Community Center, so if you just follow Park Hill right out to Highway 28, the Douro Community Center is kitty corners.
There you go. So if I were not busy that day, I would be there because this is something that I'm interested in. And I would suggest everybody else go.
Yeah,
actually.
You have to register by next Tuesday because we have to order meals.
Plan food,
okay.
Yes. That makes sense. So register today.
Please do.
There you go.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yep, I've been talking with Sue Chan, and thank you all for listening. And this concludes Smooth Operator.